Mob boss. That was one of the memorable lines this week. People familiar with Donald Trump saying he sounded like a mobster in the now infamous call with Ukraine's president, with the threats and the hinting to get where he wanted to go. Trump saying the U.S. does a lot for Ukraine, so now it's time to do us a favor, and it's, quote, very important you do it. And then getting to the point, all the talk he said about Biden's son. Adam Schiff said it was more like a mob boss than a president.
What those notes reflect is a classic mafia-like shakedown of a foreign leader. Like any mafia boss, the president didn't need to say, that's a nice country you have. It'd be a shame if something happened to it, because that was clear from the conversation.
He is quoting, of course, the Untouchables.
Nice to have a family.
Yes, it is.
Man should take care. See that nothing happens to him.
And it's not just Democratic critics. You are looking at the cover of the great journalistic institution, The New Yorker, where you see Trump and Giuliani literally pushing Uncle Sam off a bridge with his feet in cement. I'm joined now by Barbara Rez, who worked for the Trump Organization, not in a criminal capacity, but in business. Author of All Alone on the 68th Floor, and Robert Dietz, former senior counselor to the CIA, a director, and a former general counsel at the NSA. So thrilling to have both of you bring your different perspectives. Robert, what happens in the event that, as we've seen in these call notes, people inside the U.S. government are asked to go along with what they may view as unlawful orders?
And on this kind of investigation, you start with the people lower down for lots of different reasons. These are people, in their 30s, 40s, who say, wait a minute, I've got a career in front of me, or at least I hope I have a career in front of me. I'm not going to take a fall for a president or for a senior White House advisor. So I think that's part of the way you break apart what looks to be a unified group of people.
Well, but what I'm getting at is, what are they supposed to do? I mean, you worked at the inside highest levels where most of us never get to, and y'all do some things that are questionable. I mean, the intelligence agencies, the CIA, you do tough stuff, and I'm sure sometimes people think, God, did we cross the line? But what happens when it's not tough and on the line, but so over the line that somebody says, I don't know that we should carry this out. I don't know that we should work with a foreign government to sabotage a domestic candidate.
Well, there are a couple of ways of addressing it. Certainly, one of the classic ways is simply saying, with all respect, I resign. That's something I cannot do. Another way, and this is quite common in Washington, as you all know very well, is to do confidential calls to the press. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing increasingly the information leaking out of the White House. And I think that's designed in part for people to make sure that they're okay with the law. Yeah,
and Barbara, to Robert's point, those are individuals who do all kinds of stuff and do want to have careers. And then this president, more so than others, according to what we're learning, pushes it even further. When you worked around him, what do you recognize here in that call?
Oh, it's very, very Trump. He's setting up his plausible deniability. I didn't tell them to do this. I just suggested that, things are going on and maybe, they should look into it, And then, hammer.
Did he use that for all orders? In other words, if he said, I want gold doorknobs versus I want something that I might get in trouble for, does he lean more into that style, which Schiff calls that mafia style, when he knows it's bad stuff?
Only when he knows that it's questionable. Not necessarily bad, but he might be doing something with an individual that he doesn't want to be associated with, so he has someone else do it. But it's, go do this.
Take a listen to Michael Cohen making a similar point.
Mr. Trump did not directly tell me to lie to Congress. That's not how he operates. That's how he speaks. He doesn't give you questions. He doesn't give you orders. He speaks in a code.
Yeah, it's a code. But everyone knows it. I mean, you know, at least those of us who were closer to Donald absolutely knew what he wanted. You know, this would be good, or we should have, this should be this way, or, but not do it, not that. Or maybe with some very close people who would, you know, take a fall for him, but not at least at my level. And I saw him do it with a lot of people at my level.
Robert, when you look at what is publicly known, would you advise anyone who is involved in the calls or carrying any of this out in the White House and the agencies to be careful that they might have their own legal exposure, or we're not there yet?
Oh, absolutely. And I think many of these people probably do realize that they are facing some kind of exposure. I mean, you can certainly use hidden language like "do me a favor" and so forth, but played before a jury, even, let alone people in the House of Representatives, people are going to understand what was intended and what was meant because of what followed on from that.
So
Mr. Giuliani's visit.
Even though briefly we provide a lot of protection for, say, someone in the CIA following orders, if they went to Ukraine and brought back stuff to help Trump 2020, you think they could be in trouble?
Oh, absolutely. Bear in mind, at the CIA or NSA or any of these intel agencies, when people are concerned, they come to the Office of the General Counsel. I counseled people from time to time who are worried that something was on the edge. So, yeah, of course, they ought to be concerned. They've got mortgages to pay.
Robert Dietz and Barbara Rez, thank you both. Really interesting, somewhat chilling, but very interesting stuff. I appreciate it. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.